I'm Jim Mintert from the Purdue Center for Commercial Agriculture, and I want to thank you for joining us for our webinar this morning. It's focused on family business as a competitive advantage. And joining me on this morning's webinar are Maria Marshall. Maria is a professor in ag economics and the director of the new Purdue Initiative for Family Firms. And also joining us is Renee Wiatt. Renee Wiatt is a senior research associate in the Purdue Initiative for Family Firms. And thank you for both of us. Thank you for joining us this morning. We really appreciate that. And we really want to talk about the advantages that family businesses offer. I think sometimes we focus a little bit on the problems associated with family businesses, but your research suggests that there's really some tremendous advantages to family businesses. And we want to talk a little bit about how we can take advantage of that. So let's kind of kick it off here. And you've, Ray, have talked about the fact that foundation for a successful family business really has some key points that you want to emphasize here.
Sure. Well, the first one is you have to keep a business that's strong enough to actually have, the next generation come in and participate in the business. And you have to have strong family bonds that actually ties the family together. So a lot of times we see that we've got families that think of the business as the glue that brings it all together. But I think the foundation is that both of these systems have to work together and have to actually be strong enough to be able to balance each other out, because we're always talking about a balance between the family and the business. And I think that's why a lot of times we think of family businesses as, oh my gosh, that family component is sometimes thought of as a burden instead of what can really be a competitive advantage that most research shows that you actually have in a family business.
And so I guess to back up a little, you also like to think initially about whether or not this business has enough size, large enough, capable of generating enough income for that family member to join, and then start thinking about some of the other characteristics of that business and how they might fit in and become an advantage over time, right?
For sure, and it's different between different industries, what you would need in terms of size and scale and scope and all of those things, profitability. We've seen that, if you're going to go into a farm, for example, you're definitely going to see that you might need a lot more assets, right? It's highly capital intensive. Whereas, for example, if you owned a printing business, you might not need the capital in terms of equipment or land and things like that, but you're going to need sales to bring that other person in. So it depends on industry what you're going to need. But yes, you're going to have a business that's strong enough to be able to bring in another member of the family or several members of the family if their expertise aligns with the family business as well. That's another thing to think about.
Yeah, okay. So let's think a little bit about some of those characteristics. And you've done a lot of research on this over the years, along with colleagues at other universities and with Renee as well. Let's think a little bit about some of those characteristics of a successful family business.
Sure. So some of the things that research has shown that successful family businesses have in common is, first of all, you have to have shared values. So we're going to talk about it throughout because I think that's a major competitive advantage. But the values of the family, the values of the founder are passed on generation to generation because that's how we grew up. That's how we structure our values in the family. And you have to have shared power, which means that when you divide responsibilities based on the expertise of people, not, kind of sometimes it's by, well, I don't like to do this, so you're going to do it, but actually thinking about that shared power so it doesn't build resentment. Tradition, having a strong enough tradition that this is the way we do things, but also understanding that traditions have to change and grow as you bring in new members into the business, as you bring new members into the family as well, because remember, these are shared systems. Willingness to learn and grow, so kind of this willingness to share, willingness to be able to change things as they go along. And that can be difficult as you have generational differences to kind of think about, okay, what things do we have to keep together? What things do we want to be able to change so we can grow? And how much do we want to grow? Is that going to affect us as a family and affect us as a business? And then, of course, strong family ties. That's when things go badly. That's kind of what we fall back on. We fall back on it in our normal everyday life. But when you have these dual systems working together, those are the things that sometimes really help us when, there's a downturn or a recession or the business is not doing so well, is all hands on deck. And I think Renee has some statistics to share about this from our research.
Yeah, so just talking about the success of family businesses, about a third of family businesses consider themselves very successful, whereas if you look at non-family businesses, it's only about a fifth that think that they're very successful. So there is a big, even perceived success is different among those. We have a family business functionality assessment that's been established and validated. We have a question of the month up on our website that we're going to talk a little bit later, but these are some questions from our question of the month. So our first question is, how often are you satisfied that you can turn to people at home and work when something is troubling you? We like to see a lot of people say all of the time and most of the time. The orange lines up there are from our question of the month that's on our website. So those could be any kind of family businesses throughout the U.S., throughout the state. But our family business succession survey, those are the blue lines. And that is a Midwestern survey of farm businesses and agribusinesses just in the Midwest. So you can see the difference in the results there.
So, but you'd like to see people responding, well, all the time would be perfect, right? But
Right.
that's not going to happen too often for everybody.
Right.
But certainly one of those first two categories, and if you're down in one of those bottom three categories,
Then-
there's some issues for the farm to think about.
Right. Maybe there's some communication breakdown that's not going as well, or maybe they need to have more meetings where people can openly talk about things.
Okay. Let's take a look at the second question.
Sure. So question 2 is, how often are you satisfied that others in your family and business accept and support your ideas and thoughts? So this is a big one. How open are people in the family business to looking at different things from different angles and looking at different opinions? Some of our other research actually showed that businesses that do value differences in opinions generate about $140,000 more per year in income than family businesses that do not value difference of opinions. So that can have a huge impact.
So what that's telling us, I think, Maria, is that when you bring in those other opinions, they're bringing in some good ideas, right?
Exactly. That's where you go back to that successful family business, willingness to learn and grow. It definitely impacts your business and the bottom line of your business.
Yeah, so if you get in one of these situations where the people at the top, the original owners, think that they know everything, that's a characteristic of a business perhaps that over time is going to experience some difficulties, right?
Yep.
Okay. Let's take a look at the next question, Renee.
So question 3 is, how often are you satisfied with the way others in your family and business share time together? So, families who are in business often compete for resources and time. They're sharing this time with the business and the family. They have to decide, am I going to go to that soccer game, or am I going to spend a little bit more time with the business? But this is actually talking about, how do the family and the business share time together? We're happy to see that a lot of people said most of the time, about 50% said most of the time or more. They're happy with the way that time is shared.
So I see, I'm looking at this one, particularly on your web survey, it looks like you had some respondents, maybe 15% of the respondents said that they hardly ever spend time, or share time together. What does that tell you? Are those indications of a problem?
So this could be a balance issue. Maybe they need to better balance the time between the family and the business. Maybe they need to bring more people on board. Maybe they need to step away from the business. That could come from a lot of different scenarios, but definitely that's something to look into for those businesses who respond that they're not satisfied with the way that the family and the business share time together.
Maria, sometimes I know in the Center for Commercial Ag, we've worked with some operations that have chosen to schedule time together that's away from work. Is that a way to address this issue? In other words, they try to do some recreational things periodically throughout the year to try and build some better relationships. Is that a strategy people should think about?
Definitely, that's a strategy, especially when you bring in the employees' families as well, remember, because this is a shared balance between the family and the business. So understanding, okay, how much time are you spending on one resource, which the other? So if you're, for example, we see this a lot in new family businesses, so new entrepreneurs where you're using a lot of family resources, you might be spending 80, 90 hours a week working in the business. How that actually affects your family dynamic. So understanding how, yes, you have to share time together as a workforce, but also bringing in the family members to make sure that there's not competing. So if you're going to go to the 4-H fair, for example, from the example we've talked about earlier, so are the family members of those employees also going to the fair? So it becomes a family activity, a business but family activity. So that's where this comes to a head, is like, well, you have to understand that, yes, the business is important and that unit is important, but also bringing in that periphery of shareholders and bringing in those families as well to kind of share this balanced time together. So what this shows me is that there is a lot of imbalance that could be happening in a lot of these family businesses, where a lot of time is spent usually on the business, and the family starts to feel that effect of that non-shared time. or you are spending a lot of time in family. Sometimes you have people that say, well, you have to be in the shop at 6 a.m., but I have to drop my kids off. Well, that can become a problem, right? Because that spouse is saying, well, do you really need to be there at 6 a.m.? It would be nice if you could be here and help me get the kids out to school today, and not every day be at the shop doing whatever it is you're doing at 6 a.m., drinking a cup of coffee or, working on the machinery. So that's where these things come into play, and it's something to talk about in the family business.
So, Renee, maybe another way of thinking of this is to think about the business needs to think about an employee's total time commitment, which includes their family time as well as what they need to do with respect to working on the job. Is that right?
Sure. Yeah.
So combine those and think about it from a little bigger picture than what we often think about, because we have a tendency to think about just what the job is and recognize that individual has bigger commitments or other commitments besides the job.
So a perfect example of this, if you have somebody coming in and they could be on call and you can tell them not to come in because you don't have enough business, are you telling them 30 minutes before they have to come into work? They've already dropped off their child to daycare, and now they have nothing to do for those, that now they have the expense of daycare and they haven't and have nothing to do for the day. Or you're telling them 3 hours ahead of time so they can make arrangements. They don't have to take their child to daycare, so they're not making that expense. So understanding, that it's a whole day. It's not just 8 to 5.
Yeah, good point. All right, let's take a look at the next question, Renee.
Sure. So this question was only online on our question of the month, and this is question 4. How often are you satisfied with the outcome when a decision has to be made in favor of what is best for the family versus the family business? So this once again comes back to that dynamic of sharing time between the business and the family. When it is a family business, it's easier, right, to bring the business home to your family versus, say, you have an 8 to 5 job where you go to the office and work. It's easier to leave your work at work when you have that situation, not so much when you have a family business.
So there's a time dimension to that, but there's also maybe an income component to that as well, right, Maria?
Of course, there's this resource component. So if the business makes however much profit or income, and a decision has to be made, are we going to spend that and invest it in the business, or are we going to bring that income home? That's a decision that has to be made, one for the other. So are you satisfied with how those decisions are coming out in terms of time commitment, but also income in and of itself is how much are you bringing into the family and how much you're investing back in. And a lot of times that also has to do with how you perceive the business. So if you perceive the business as something I want to continue to grow and it's something we keep investing on, so you might constantly be investing in the business and not bringing a lot of income home. Or if you think of the business as something you're extracting income from, so then you're taking income from the business to kind of bring it home. And that might be, the person who's actually working day to day in the business management might think, well, I should be investing more. And the person who's also co-owner but doesn't have day-to-day management might be thinking, well, the business is there for us for our income. So it could be just a matter of perceptions of how do you think of the business and how are decisions being made about those investments.
And the key there, I think, is probably going to be communications, right?
Communications and expectations, right? This is where goals come into play and understanding, well, what's the goal of the business? How risk averse or not are we in the business in terms of what are the business strategies that we want to put in place?
I know in agriculture, what we sometimes run into is a situation where the business manager makes a decision on behalf of the business, and then the family becomes the residual claimant. That's a problem. That becomes a problem very quickly.
Yes.
And communication can help avoid that, right?
Yes.
Okay.
No, definitely. And this is where that comes down is, how satisfied are you about the decisions that you're making for one versus the other? Because a lot of times that's what you're doing.
Yeah. Take a look at, this is really kind of a summary slide. So kind of explain to us what's going on this slide first, and then I want to talk about the results.
Sure. So we took these 4 questions and kind of made a scale. You can judge the business from dysfunctional all the way up to highly functional. The black lines are the Family Business Succession Survey. So those are our Midwestern agribusinesses, farm businesses, vegetable businesses, horticultural businesses, things like that in the Midwest. Whereas the gold bars there, they are all over. So this is a national survey of family businesses in all sectors. So this kind of shows us where these fall. So when you look at the moderately dysfunctional, you have about 55% of agricultural farm businesses that are moderately dysfunctional and about 45% that are highly functional. If you look at national businesses, all family businesses throughout the nation, we've got more of those ranked in the highly functional category. So I don't know if farm businesses and agribusinesses are more honest about how functional they are, or, you know, if that's just the agribusiness component where, you know, the farm and the family are so closely tied that it often is brought home. So maybe that leads to a little bit more dysfunction.
So for a little bit of clarity, you used the 5 questions, or I guess it was 4 questions that we just looked at, and used that to construct a composite index so that you could classify farms.
Correct.
So depending on how people respond to those questions, you could categorize them as being dysfunctional, moderately, or highly functional, right?
That's correct.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way before, the fact that we could maybe use those kind of responses. As you think about that, and our audience might be thinking about responding to those questions on their own, are there some keys you can look at in terms of making some improvements, or is it something where you need to step back and look at it from a big picture perspective?
Oh, I think you can definitely make some improvements. If you answer those 4 questions, you might know where you're really scoring low, right? Or where you feel like there might be some dysfunction. And it's also important, I think, for several members of the family to actually take what we would call the family business APGAR, or FB brag, as we're calling it now. So maybe you want to brag at how functional you really are. But I think it's important for all of them, because one person may feel like they're really dysfunctional in terms of communicating, or feeling that they're heard. Maybe sometimes that's usually the second or junior generation. And you might have where somebody feels like the decisions that are being made aren't exactly what they would be hoping for, and that might be the senior generation. So you might have this dysfunction in different places. So it definitely, you know, in our mind, it's a place for people to start talking about where there may be some communication breakdown, or where they just want more communication. So a lot of times we think, well, there's no problems because, you know, there's no conflict, but a lot of times that means that you haven't talked about anything.
The conflict's still there.
The conflict
it's
under
right?
the surface,
Yeah.
exactly right. So this is kind of a very easy way. It's 4 questions to talk about, look it on a scale, and then talk about it together as a family. I'm like, wow, I didn't know you felt that way, and kind of to start those conversations going without being pointing the finger. Why don't you ever talk to me about this?
So if you're going to do this, and I think this is something they could do by maybe looking on the website, participating in some workshops, et cetera, it's important for everybody in that family business to complete that and start thinking about it. And then one of the things I think you'd probably look for is differences across the family members, right?
Right, exactly right.
So, all right. Maria, I think you were talking earlier today to me about this 3-circle model of family business. So why don't you walk through that? That's
Sure.
an interesting diagram we've got there.
So, there's different models of modeling a family business. It's all related really to a systems theory. So this is just one way of looking at the family business, and it's called the 3 circles model of family business. And basically it's the 3 circles. You've got ownership, you've got a family circle, you've got a business circle, and in between you've got people that overlap in different ways in those circles. So for example, where I've got GF, that's grandfather, GM, grandmother, and maybe mother, they're ownership and family, but they're not working day to day in the business portion, but they have an ownership there. You might have the father, son 1, daughter 1, right in the middle. They're ownership, family, and working day to day in the business. You might have that niece, family, business, but not ownership. You might have a partner, maybe that's part of ownership business, but they're not a family member. And then I've got son 2 and brother of the father, I can say, that are part of the family. They're not part of the ownership of the business, and they're not working in the business. But they're all shareholders, or all stakeholders, let me say that, of the business in some way or another, because the grandparents might have been the ones that are their founding generations. Their worldview is what started the business, and all those the rest of the generations are kind of keeping up and maybe molding that worldview, but that core worldview is there. But even the ones that are family and not ownership in business still have something to say about their business. They still usually carry pride about that family business out in the community. But when you're thinking about strategy and thinking about the competitive advantage and this thing about learning and growing and having differences of opinion, all the different functions of people within these circles bring different perspectives. So understanding what those perspectives are, not only as you as the business are putting out communication to the stakeholders of the business, but also receiving that back. So when you have a family business, how well are you doing in terms of educating ownership and family that are not part of that day-to-day business about what's going on in the business, how the business may be growing, or what's going wrong in the business, and what may be some things that you need to change. So it's important to be communicating in all of these spheres. So that's what this representation says.
So I think this diagram is actually pretty interesting, Maria, because you've depicted a business and a family that's not excessively large, yet you've got a lot of relationships depicted on that screen, more than I'd thought about, truthfully, before I looked at the diagram. And so what kind of recommendations do you have? We talked before the show started a little bit about the challenges of communicating up and down a leadership chain and an employee chain. As you look at a diagram like that, what kind of recommendations do you have for people to communicate with all those different groups? And I like the way you've categorized that. Really makes me think about things a little bit differently.
So a lot of family business would have a family business council that would be different from a family board, right? Family business board where you're doing about it. But family business council actually looks at values of the family, the way the business interacts with the family. This is how you can educate family members that are part of that kind of sometimes ownership in family, not day-to-day management, and just the family itself. So that would be one way, or one recommendation about how do you communicate and how do you keep those communications lines open. But it has a lot to do with governance and the way that you govern the business and the policies that you have in the business.
The reason I think this is kind of interesting is the fact that a lot of people, perhaps myself included, tend to think about decision making needs to be focused on the people that have an ownership stake. And you've just suggested you need to reach outside that ownership stake and think about how you're communicating with people that don't necessarily have direct ownership in the business. If they're part of this family in some way, they've still got a connection, and you characterize them as stakeholders. I think that's a good term to use. So you kind of broaden our thinking a little bit about who needs to be communicated to, not just those people that have direct ownership in the business. I think that's really important. One of the things that you've talked about with respect to competitive advantages for family business is culture. You want to talk a little bit about this one?
Sure. So we've talked a lot about communication and values. Well, culture is part of those values. It's basically how values are communicated out or across. And there's this a very nice diagram of this culture iceberg. And a lot of times, the way culture is basically our values, our informal interactions, is how we grow up. And that's kind of beneath the surface. And a lot of times that's really how we get things done, even though our behavior and the way that we project are the way we think things get done, right? So you might have, for example, a culture of family values, right? And that's just ingrained in the family. But how is the behavior being translated out and throughout the business or the corporation? So one of the things that's really important about family businesses is that usually they have a stronger culture, a culture that started with the worldview of the founder and goes on generation to generation because they tied into that kind of beneath the surface core values. It's usually in a family business more sustainable for a longer period of time because it's the family's cultural values that get transmitted. And it's usually more describable than in a non-family business the way that the culture is. It's describable not only in the family because we're together or a family, those are our values, but even non-family members, it's easier for them to describe the core value and the culture of that business. And that's where the competitive advantage starts for a family business. So we've talked a lot about needing communication and kind of family dysfunction. Well, this is the flip side of why when you have a functioning family and communication structure, that really becomes a competitive advantage for you as a family business because it really allows you to bring that culture out to your employees and to your customers, and that breeds goodwill, which breeds loyalty.
Kind of unifies things, right? Kind of gives people something to organize around. They have more of an organizing principle, so to speak. That's really what you're trying to get across here. You had some examples, I think, when we were talking earlier about some situations maybe where people hadn't really identified this, and maybe you might elaborate on some of those examples a little bit.
Sure. So I think, when you're thinking about, well, we have a culture of being a family business, right? So we really value family and the family component of a family business. So that's a core value. But then when it comes to how your behavior is, you expect somebody to be there at 6 a.m. or you expect them to work every day 80 to 90 hours a week. And so the behavior that you're translating isn't actually the core value that you actually espouse, right? And so understanding how that might be a core value, but what's the behavior? That's really what people see, because in the end, that's how the core values are transmitted. That culture is translated. And so we also have that, if you have a culture of it's important for us to be together, but we're trying to be very flexible in our work environment because of new young families and things like that, but you expect people to be there every day, the behavior, the culture that you're signifying isn't really that we have a really flexible work environment. So you might say that you have a lot of, that this is what you're exposed, but the behavior that you're translating in the culture of that business isn't quite what you're saying.
And so what it really needs to do there is actually step back and ask whether or not you're being consistent, right?
That's exactly right. And people find right away when you're not being consistent, right? Because it's like, well, you say, we have a policy of making sure that everybody, for example, let's say you have a culture where the younger generation expect that once they go out for 3 years, they can come back and work in the business. So is that culture, is that behavior actually being translated? Or are you letting some in right away and some have to spend 10 years because you have no job? So what are the the second generation expectations that you have? So you may have a culture that everybody that's family can come into the business because it's a family business, that's what core. But the behavior is, but we still expect you to go out and work in another business for 3-5 years. So how are you translating that behavior?
So one of the keys there is to think about when decisions are being made, are the decisions we're making here consistent with our culture and our values, right?
Yeah, that's
sometimes
exactly
people
right.
forget that.
They do, and the reason why it's a competitive advantage in family business is because usually it's so ingrained that you have less of this, are we being consistent? Right? We're in a non-family business because it's not ingrained in the family's core values. It's a lot harder to transmit, right? That's where you have many more policies needed usually in a non-family business to transmit these values than you would in a family businesses. It's usually called agency theory. You have less policies involved to actually get that to that underneath the iceberg portion of the culture than you would in a non-family business.
Okay, so it's an advantage you can take advantage of, and if it's not an advantage in a family firm, you need to step back and think about why it's not and see if you can turn it into an advantage, right?
That's right, and there is research that shows that the third and fourth generation want to hang on to this core worldview and values of the first generation. But if you've never stepped back and said, these are the things we believe in, these are the things that are core to us, it's harder for them to come into the business and really think about what those core values are and really want to come back.
So you need to be very explicit about it. You need to sit down and think about it and lay it out on paper, for example, right?
Mm-hmm. Correct.
Which is something a lot of businesses have not done, right?
Right. A lot of times we think about visioning, which would be where you talk about your core values, really the why of what you do. Very few take a lot of time doing that, or our vision reflects more what we do than why we do what we do.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk a little bit more about culture.
Sure. So the Family Business Consulting Group put out some key words that usually reflect this competitive advantage of the culture of family businesses. And one is that family feel that goes beyond just the family, but also goes to non-family businesses as well. So it's a feeling of we're all family, we're all in this together. IKEA is one of the examples that they have in their article, and is a really good example of how values are transmitted up and down the chain and how they can have more of a flat management system than a hierarchical one. Caring. Right? It's a family business. It usually revolves around caring because we have tighter relationships than in a non-family businesses. Humility, right? Usually they're more humble than non-family businesses. That's usually a core value. A commitment to community is also an important part of what is a core value of a family business and the culture of a family business. And that actually transmits to the social capital that a family business would have in the community. So if you think of social capital as the networks that you have, so family is one of those bonding networks, then you have links to the community, and then you have links to the institutions of that community. So family businesses tend to have stronger social capital. They tend to be more involved in the community. So they have neighbors that they're tied to that understand their business, at least know that they're in business together, and they have stronger links to institutions that are part of that community because they might fundraise for somebody, they might know policymakers or the institutions, how to work the institutions. And our research shows that in a crisis, that social capital and that commitment to community makes you more resilient, helps you recover faster, and helps you actually be resilient to whatever crisis you have. So it does have a real life value to have this commitment to community and the social capital that you have from that when you're a family business. And then, of course, values, right? That's the core of the culture of a family business.
So you might elaborate on that research a little bit. I think that was some research that you did based on victims, I think, of hurricanes?
Hurricane Katrina.
Yeah. Elaborate on that a little bit, because that was really interesting to me, this idea that could actually make you more resilient, because that's a key concern of many family businesses. Can we weather a downturn? Can we weather a disaster of some sort? How will we recover? Maybe elaborate on that just a little bit.
Sure. So we did a survey of small businesses after Hurricane Katrina. These are small and medium-sized businesses of every industry. And some are family and non-family businesses, but they're small businesses. And we actually have businesses that recovered and did not recover. So that makes our survey a little bit different, because we actually found businesses that actually demised after the hurricane and then demised subsequently. So we would categorize them as people who closed right away. Then we've got survivors, right? So you're still open, but you're just surviving. You're worse off than you were before. Then we've got people who actually recovered, they're doing the same as before. So they've recovered, they've gotten at least up to the same profit level. And then we have businesses that we would call them resilient. So they're actually better off than they were before the crisis, and they've adapted, and they'd be able to weather that same crisis or a similar crisis again. And so some dissertation research from a student of mine shows that when you have this social capital, this commitment to community, this links, so you've got bonding, linking, and bridging, what would be the components of social capital, you actually are more resilient to a disaster. So the more linked you are to community, the more you have basically those networks come to help you in the end. So you've helped, and it's kind of this reciprocity that you would have with the community, and you actually are more resilient to a disaster.
That's fascinating. I guess I hadn't thought of it that way, and I think that's maybe not the number one reason you would have a stronger commitment to community, but it is demonstrative of the fact that it can be really important, right?
Sure enough, and it's also a lot of family businesses may be in rural areas, and you need that kind of reciprocity and loyalty between you and the community to be able to just live day to day. And you're a member of the community, not just a business owner. So it's really important.
Yeah. Okay. You mentioned this a minute ago. Maybe this is a chance to elaborate on it a bit. The why, the how, and the what.
Okay, so a lot of times when, as a business in general, besides being a family business, we're just more comfortable communicate the what we do and maybe how we do it. So the what we do may be, let's use farming as an example. You may be a corn grower, and how you do it, you may say, well, I use no-till. Let's just use that for example. I'm probably stretching all my ag examples here, but we don't really say why we do it. Right. So, when somebody asks, "Well, what are you?" Well, I'm a corn grower. Well, or what you do is that what you're passionate about is making sure that the world is fed in a sustainable fashion, or that you believe in providing and maintaining the land in the way that you got it and in a better fashion for the next generation. That's why you do what you do. And research has shown that what breeds loyalty in our customers, in our employees, is when we communicate why we do what we do instead of what. Because when you say, well, I believe that everybody should have access to good, nutritious food, for example, then somebody is comfortable buying everything from you: corn, soybeans, fruits, vegetables, meat from you, versus I grow corn, and what I know you for is growing corn, and now you're trying to sell me vegetables, lettuce, and that's not what you said that you do, right? And so when you get to the why, you can sell a lot of what's.
So the other thing we talked about, and you kind of alluded to this, a lot of people in agriculture today are focused on leaving the land in better condition than what they found it. And it's a way of communicating sustainability. So we're in the business of producing corn, soybeans, beef, pork, etc. But we're also in this business from a long-term perspective of leaving the land and the environment in better condition than what we found it. And that gives them a unifying principle in terms of that why we do what we do. And that literally they can ask themselves almost every day with respect to the practices they're pursuing, is this helping us move towards making that land better, making things more sustainable, improving the environment, et cetera, right?
Yeah, not only that, but it also transmits your core value, that culture, generation to generation. Because what if in the next generation they're going to be wheat growers? Does that mean that they're not the same, that they don't have that core value, that culture hasn't been transmitted? You know, because things may change, right? But that core value, that culture gets transmitted. And it goes beyond family businesses. You might have cooperatives, we talked about this earlier in the morning, that have these core principles. And what they're finding is that they may not have the same loyalty in millennials and the next generation that they had in that, let's call it the senior generation, because they haven't really been talking about what those core principles are. Right? You're talking about the what that the co-op is doing for you, better prices or get you inputs. Instead of these are the core principles about shared ownership, member engagement, community values. A core principle of a cooperative is community engagement, which is actually very attractive to millennials. So it does have an effect on bringing in another generation and bringing in people when you get away from talking about the why of what you do. This doesn't mean this is the only thing you talk about, but it has to be the foundation that you communicate, especially as you're trying to get new generations to come in on board to be part of something that has been part of their family. They might not have that loyalty to you if you only communicate what.
Yeah, so if you skip over the why, you do so at your peril.
I think so. You do so in your peril, not only in the short run, but also in the long run.
Yeah, maybe especially in the long run, I think. So you've talked about culture affects business strategy. Let's kind of elaborate on that a little bit.
So we've just talked about how the why of what you do transmits your culture and your core values. So if you think about family values, so understanding what those and writing those down, what those core values are, is important. Transmitting that into a cohesive vision for the family. Then, you know, if you have a family business, I know you have a vision written down somewhere, or a mission written down somewhere, which is the what of what you do, right? Not the why. And then that affects business strategy. So that's going to affect how risk averse you may be, right? What you're doing in terms of the land and the things that you change. It's going to affect how profitable you're going to be, because it's going to affect your business strategies. So that vision does affect the short-term strategy, but it definitely affects your long-term strategy of how you do business. So the why gets to, these are their core values and culture, and then that strategy is the how and the what of your culture.
And the way I like to think of that sometimes is after you establish the why, every time you're thinking about a what, you should always kind of come back in the back of your mind and ask yourself, is this supportive of why we're in business, right? It's kind of a checkpoint, so to speak.
Oh, for sure. Not only that, but when you have these things clearly articulated, your employees know how you do business, right? And what you do. So you think about, you could translate this directly into customer service, the way a family business would do customer service, right? You're empowered your employees to make sure that they get things right the first time. So it goes on all up and down the chain. We tend to think that it's business strategy, and then we get up here into the goals and visions and how do they, but it actually gets into the everyday business that you do in your business and how those values are and culture is translated.
Yeah, so you've given us a great reason to think about the why part. And I know when we've done workshops, and probably you as well, people sometimes struggle with that. They tend to want to skip over that. I think you've given us a great reason why we shouldn't skip over that, why it's a really important aspect of family businesses.
And actually, Jim, before we get to the next slide, I think Renee has some statistics on how goals and all those things actually affect your bottom line.
Yeah, let's share those.
Yeah. So when we were looking at goals in our research, we looked at goals and how that can translate. Family businesses versus non-family businesses actually set goals a lot more often. So family businesses set goals on a quarterly basis or more, about 50% of them. Whereas if you look at non-family businesses, they only set goals on a quarterly basis about 35% of the time. And so you're setting these goals, right? But then what happens? So our research actually looked into how well are these families achieving these goals. So family businesses are a lot more successful at actually achieving those goals once they do set them versus non-family businesses. So there are so many benefits of having a family business.
That really does kind of elaborate on a little bit on why this is important. So Renee, I think you've spent a lot of time building a website here at Purdue, which just launched a few weeks ago. So Walk us through a little bit of some of the content our viewers could find on the website.
Sure. So as you mentioned before, this is the new initiative housed in the Department of Ag Econ. It's the Purdue Initiative for Family Firms. We have all kinds of information on our website that people can access. So when you look at this pie, you can see we've got different topics highlighted here. Estate and personal financial planning. We've got strategic business planning, leadership and succession planning, and maintaining family bonds. The maintaining family bonds portion of the pie is kind of what we delved into today. And so if people go to our website, it's purdue.ag/PIF. You can click on that maintaining family bonds. You can take that family business functioning assessment that we talked about earlier that has those questions. You can download all kinds of information that can help your business, your family business better communicate, plan for succession planning, which is huge. You can look at that estate and personal financial planning, strategic business planning. We have all of those resources there. We also have a question of the month, and that's where a lot of those questions that we talked about earlier in those charts, that's where those came from. We're going to be launching a new question of the month in February, so people can take the question of the month still today, but tomorrow it should be a different one, so they can look and see what's there. You can also subscribe to our quarterly newsletter, which will be coming out in February. You can look at, we've also got a family business workshop coming up.
Maria, you want to elaborate a little bit on the content of the workshop coming up here on March 9 and 10 in West Lafayette. Tell us a little bit about the workshop.
Sure. So the workshop it's called the Family Business Workshop, and it revolves around succession planning, or starting the process of communicating around succession planning. So a lot of the morning portion is about communication, and actually we help you we give you the assessment of the Myers-Briggs, so you kind of think about how you're communicating, how that affects. We talk about visioning. Then we have sessions with a lawyer to talk about some structural things that you might want to do in succession planning, job descriptions. So we start you on this process. It's a day and a half, a lot of interactive sessions to get you thinking about the process of succession planning and move on from there.
So who should attend the workshop? Who's your target audience there?
Family businesses who definitely have a senior generation who want to bring in a junior generation, or if you've just brought in a junior generation and are thinking about it, I think it's important I would bet that there's a lot of things you have not discussed yet. And so I think it would I think they would find it very helpful. A lot of times these workshops are in some ways a safe space to kind of start these conversations, to understand, well, when I come in with a cup of coffee in the first thing in the morning and you don't want to talk, now I know why. Or when I need, an hour to kind of think about what you want to bring, this is when I know why. And these are the things that the junior generation has brought in terms of different ways of doing things. And so I think it's a really good way to come together, spend a day and a half away from the day-to-day pressures of the business, to start talking about these issues and how you want to move forward.
So you want multiple generations to attend. If it's a senior generation bringing in a junior generation, you want both generations to be present at the workshop, right?
Oh, for sure. You don't want to it defeats the purpose if it's just the senior generation or the junior generation. Although we have had sometimes where the junior generation says, well, at least I want to have a background to be able to get to that senior generation to come back. But yes, it would be preferable if you have both generations there. Sometimes you've got 3 generations there as well, which is you really have a lot to talk about. There's a lot of values and different goals and perspectives, like we showed in those 3 circles, that need to be thought through.
And you would expect to have businesses, a wide variety of businesses represented. So there'll be some farm businesses, there'll be some non-farm businesses, and
That's
those
right.
Businesses can learn a little bit from each other, right?
Oh, for sure. We had last year when we had our family business workshop, we had farm businesses and we had non-farm businesses, and it was an interesting interaction because the problems are the same. The fundamental problems are the same. It just means the way you deal with them are different. You might have farming, like we said, is more capital intensive. You might need to say, well, if I bring in the next generation, I need $1.5 million, where another non-farm business says, well, we just need to make 10% or 30% more sales. It's a different way of thinking of how those assets need to be thought through to bring a different generation, but the basic problems are the same. But it definitely is interesting to see them, these peer groups come together and talk about these things.
Yeah, they get a chance to network at the conference, share challenges, and share success stories as well, right?
That's
Things
right.
that have worked well. So lots of opportunities to learn, not just from the presenters, but also from each other at the conference.
That's correct,
So
yes.
So check that out. More details are available, Renee, on the website, right? If
That's
you're interested in
correct.
registering, you'll get some details on how to register and proceed from that point. So check out the website when you have an opportunity. Some more contact information. Maria's email is up on the screen as well as Renee's. If you've got questions for either one of them, feel free to send them an email and get some more details, whether it's on the workshop or another issue. They'd be happy to respond to that as well. So with that, I want to say thank you for joining us on our webinar today, and I hope you'll take advantage of all the great information from the Purdue Initiative for Family Firms. I do also want to say that coming up next week on February 9th, the Center for Commercial Agriculture has another webinar, and it'll be focused on the first quarter of the Ag Economy Barometer. We'll be releasing a new Ag Economy Barometer on Tuesday of next week, and so we'll have a webinar focused on the results from that on February 9th, and that will take place in the afternoon, and of course also be available on our website in a YouTube format. So with that, thanks for joining us.